MediaMath's a programmatic buying and data management platform for digital marketers. And the thing I wanted to talk today about a little bit was how customer engagement has changed in a new multi-screen world, in a programmatic world. And I want to start maybe unintuitively with a moment in time or an image from one of the last great consumer revolutions, which was the department store. So you think of Selfridges in 1917 represented sort of this watershed event in consumption. Gone were the days of trudging to multiple stores as shopping as a necessity. Here were the days of the Thorsten Veblen-esque conspicuous consumption, right? So instead of having to go to 4 stores to buy my necessities, I'm going to dress the kids up, and I'm going to go to a place that has curated a consumer experience for me, has thought about cafes and reading areas and placement of goods, and I see perfume when I walk in, and by the time I get to menswear, I've already been distracted by the haberdashery on the way, right? This idea of curated experience, I think, is important to think about as we go into the digital world, because it's still used today in the offline world, right? In the hyper data-driven world of Tesco and Carrefour and Asda and Walmart and Target, the placement of product on shelf, what goes in the end cap, what are the promotions that bring people in, is a closely studied science. And the reason is, for the first principle here, is that optimizing that curated store experience drives ROI. And I think intuitively, that makes a ton of sense to all of us. So my first proposition for everyone here today is that that curated in-store world looks a lot more like the world of a Selfridges in 1920 than it does the world that the 1950 TV, radio, and print buyer lived in. Now, why is that? The first tenet here is that the moment of brand exposure and the moment of favorability or the moment of actual purchase are proximate. So unlike the world in which I sit on my couch and I see an advertisement for a promotion at Sainsbury, and then a week later when I'm shopping, I may have recall against it. Today, I am in the tube, I'm on a bus, I'm walking down the street, I'm passively watching TV, consuming other media, and all the time, if I get the right message in front of me, I could potentially be showing favorability, acting on that message. As I walk through the door at Boots, the 10p off of a case of Coca-Cola might incent me to actually buy the product, right? So totally different world than the one of sort of long cycle feedback loop media planning. The second reason is that the data feedback's in real time. So you think about that Selfridges, and I am in front of the clerk and I'm choosing a suit. If he's smart, he's going to be picking out the shoes and tie that go well with that. And the clerk that's helping the woman choose a dress isn't probably that good if she's suggesting the same thing, right? So we get that idea of relevancy of offer in situ, with the corollary being that it places a premium on the ability to optimize in real time, which again, I think is sort of a logical follow-up. So the sort of summation here is that like an offline store, your consumer is always in your store, whether you're an FMCG, whether you're an online retailer, whether you are selling gaming, whatever it would be, because you're always close to that moment of consideration or of purchase. And secondly, that optimizing against real-time data has a real meaning. So let's step back a moment. If we think about the way marketers traditionally, if you take any sort of university course in Marcom, you'll see some version of this, right? That consumers move from awareness all the way through favorability to consideration to purchase. The problem with this is that it does not represent today, nor did it ever represent the way that consumers actually think. None of us walk around and think awareness, 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 favorability, oh, consideration, purchase, right? Like, it just doesn't happen. We certainly don't do it in the way that actually today digital technology works, where we think awareness, awareness, and display, oh, consideration and email marketing, across multiple channels. What this represents is a world in which the finest grain granularity that we have against a consumer is at the channel level. So I will say today the canonical funnel represents a channel-centric way of thinking about marketing and not a consumer way. When the only way you have to break out your marketing is that TV equals awareness and that print equals demand capture, this is what your world looks like. This is the mental model you need to use. In reality, this is probably much more representative of what an actual consumer journey looks like. At any moment, every single person in this room is in the middle of a path similar to this across thousands of products and product categories. You're in the middle, even if you just bought a car, you're 6 years away or 5 years away from a consideration cycle and buying your next car. If you were going to buy breath mints, you were in a 30-second consideration cycle. In the short of it, all of these things are going on at such a staggering amount of granularity and number of decisions that it's almost incomprehensible. The problem here is that in a digital world, as we just talked about, that data is actually coming in real time. Those signals are there. We have the ability to make good on being the good clerk in the Selfridges. The problem is that we're caught in the old mental model. So what happens here is that the display advertising team and the social advertising team and the CRM folks and the direct mail team, none of those talk to each other. They treat each of us, as completely separate people, and they're giving us completely incorrect methodologies. The digital systems that underpin that sort of way of thinking are similar. Your DFA ad serving account doesn't talk to your Google account or to your Facebook account, doesn't talk to the system that you might be using for social sentiment tracking, doesn't talk to your email outbound system. So the problem is that we're caught in a world today. What we need, and I think the mental model that I'd like to propose here today, is one of the operating systems. So in a world in which the consumers whom we are trying to reach are multi-screen, are using multiple systems, have millions and millions of potential touch points in any given period of time, we need to think about some sort of system to organize that and automate it. And the analogy I would use is you on your cell phone don't think of the literally millions of decisions that have to be made for you to do a Facebook post, right? You don't think about the millions of decisions that are going on in the process of your computer to produce a PowerPoint presentation. So I think the same analogy happens here, where the granularity and the ability to fine-tune the message to the consumer happens at such a massive scale. There's just no way to operate, and what we should be focused on is how do you buttress that with a software layer such that now marketers are able to make much higher value and higher level sort of decisions. So I'll pause there for a moment and maybe step back and define what do I mean when I'm saying programmatic. And I think a good general definition is primarily automated means of marketing versus primarily manual ones. So that could be everything in decision based on rule sets. It could be automated algorithms. It could be connectivity of old systems with new systems. But writ large, it's an automation of the marketing process versus a manual, primarily manual operation. I'll go a step further and say my personal definition here would start with the centralization of consumer identity in one place across channels. So ability to match personally identifiable information with non-personally identifiable information with a connected ID that probabilistically and deterministically finds me on my phone, on my TV, on my laptop, et cetera, and then gives me the ability to leverage media against all those touch points in a unified way. So it's sort of the old Java sol of write once, run everywhere. The second part of it that I think is very important is that programmatic enables marketers, both agencies and brands directly, to leverage their existing data, media, and technology assets. So being in this space pretty close to the beginning with a team that has started this off even 14 years hence, you realize if you go to enough of these conferences, you're just slung a ton of names, and there's all this new technology, and it's really complicated, and everybody's trying to be your trusted advisor. At the end of the day, what this looks like is the same methods used for things like direct mail marketing and those same models with like variable postage. Call it a day. It's not that much more complicated than that. Now, a lot of the technology behind it is very advanced, is very sophisticated, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to do the same thing, which is give a relevant ad to somebody at a relevant time and place. And when you make it that simple, really then what you're thinking of programmatic is how does this enable me to use all the assets that I've been building up over decades and decades and decades of good consumer marketing. What isn't programmatic? Programmatic isn't just real-time bidding. So for those who may not be less familiar, the idea of this automation grew out of the idea of monetizing publishers' inventory that had gone unsold. So the idea was, hey, the Guardian didn't sell this spot, it's going to put it out for auction, and that's where you get this real-time ability and to basically price and show an ad to a consumer that you think is of interest. The issue has become that the market's evolved such that programmatic now equals a media-like thing. And what I want to strongly propose here is that programmatic media buying is only one aspect of programmatic. The media aspect has been bundled by agencies, by some of the companies in market today, sometimes to disastrous effects with some of the players that have gone public recently that have lawsuits and all sorts of stuff. So I'd like to throw out there that it's a primarily technology and software proposition, not a media one. So just a quick worked example to go through. You can imagine a consumer going through on her iPad. She's looking at different things. She's selecting something. This is just reiterating kind of what we talked about, the real-time insight. So in real time, we're going through web pages. We're going through different contexts. By the time I arrive, the advertiser has shown me the right ad, gotten me there. In an earlier day, and frankly, the way the old mindset still works in the digital age, I'd have all these sort of data sets coming in, right? And so I'd have some profile data, I'd have CRM data, I'd have any number of data points on the consumer, but all of them, importantly, would be non-codependent, which is to say, the fact that you have a certain age doesn't mean whether you live in London or not. And the fact that you live in London doesn't mean you have 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 kids. So all the data sets are orthogonal in this world, none of them interrelate. And the output of that is a fairly broad-grained but important description. So most brands will have 4 or 5 of Jessica here. And there'll be this sort of brand archetype that they think they're trying to target, and they'll use this for their media targeting, they'll use it for creative. And it gives you sort of a broad swath, but the problem is that it doesn't answer, how do I engage with every individual Jessica? So I think one good way of thinking about the promise of programmatic is it answers not just who is my consumer, but how should I engage with her? She'll react differently and want a different message first thing in the morning when she comes into work than she will midweek when she's reading very relevant content at a specific time and place. And will be very different when she's kind of reviewing different stuff over a coffee at Nero on a Saturday, for example. Great. So that's just a quick sort of overview of what is programmatic and what's the promise for the marketer. I want to sort of finish out here the slightly higher level couple of thoughts on the industry. The first is this mental model or the image metaphor of technology driving environmental change. If you sell water and feed and a hitching post in a world where the primary conveyance is a horse, you're doing great business. If you do it where the primary conveyance is a Porsche, you've probably got few customers. So the idea here that technology both disrupts but also drives these environmental changes, right? You don't get petrol stations until you have widespread roads and automobiles. On the marketer side, the environmental change that's being driven is quick adoption. So teams being hired directly at brands, agencies from largest holding company to bottom have built whole new divisions all in the last 5 to 7 years. It's become a major point of revenue. At a place like WPP, it represents double-digit billions of dollars, right? So the trend is massive, and it's driven massive change on the media buyer side. On the marketer side, or the publisher side, it's also driven massive change. And so we have this great quotation here from Tim Gentry, Guardian's a great client of ours, talking about how they're using the ability to buy programmatic media, leveraging their unique data assets. So again, technology layer that lets the Guardian get closer to its advertisers and help them market better. You have AOL, Google here, and I think Marissa Mayer quote is especially near and dear to the heart because it suggests the idea here again that programmatic isn't premium or not premium media, it's not above, below the fold, it's not long tail, it's not anything related to media, it's automation primarily. Another interesting shift that the environmental change that this is driving is a little bit of a need for talent. So we've moved from a world in which the young people coming in the door at large brands and at agencies have sort of a soft skill, sort of more literary history, philosophy, social science sort of background to one where it's a much more hardcore quant set. And we see that across our clients consistently that the need to fill these roles is an interesting challenge in the market right now. So sort of final big analogy here to kind of finish out. Blockbuster is, some of you may know, the sort of dominant force in movie consumption in 2002. At the time, Netflix had like a tenth of the percent of people using it. You fast forward 10 years, Blockbuster literally can't sell the assets that it has at the price they're worth, and Netflix has far surpassed anything that Blockbuster ever was. And I'll say, if you count in there the group of Netflix-like objects, it's way bigger as a class than Blockbuster ever was. So how did this happen? In those intervening 10 years, the same exact product was being consumed. It was still movies, produced in largely the same way they are today, distributed in the very same way. Some of the economics have changed, but exact same product, more or less. The consumer set that consumed them, also exactly the same, from kids all the way through action movie fans, all the way from foreign thriller fans. Those categories still existed. What changed? The one thing that changed was automation of distribution. So if we look at the analogies that we have today to the modern media world, one, Netflix met the consumer where they were. So the analogy, to go back on programmatic media, was when the person was on the tube and they were ready to be influenced to buy, that's where they hit them. When they were at home ready to watch a movie, that's where they hit them. It's the exact same promise we have today in the media world. The second thing that changed was they were able to personalize the experience. So rather than spending 2 hours wandering around the aisles of a Blockbuster, suddenly I'm suggested movies that are very relevant to me. And you can see here that automation, this is just one example. Other examples happen in the financial markets and any number of other markets. The one other market, last sort of couple slides here, that I wanted to talk about was in the computing market. So the devices themselves that are driving a lot of this upheaval in the media and advertising markets and the way that they've changed. If you looked here in 1993, the year I entered university, that was the kind of computer I had to use to get on email. So you'd log into a VAX terminal, you'd go on Pine, and you'd check your email. That doesn't look so dissimilar from the computer that was used 30 years earlier. At least the person in 1963 would have been able to recognize this as a front end to a computer that he or she had used. However, if I go to the right, and I go 30 years forward, the iPad is literally unrecognizable to the user of a computer in 1993. It just looks like it's from an alien sort of place. So we look at some of these disruptive changes and we think, wow, things sort of coasted along at the same layer for a really long time, and then boom, overnight, this transformative business change came that puts Blockbuster out of business. And how can I predict that? How does that work? I'd like to suggest that luckily, this sort of progress is very predictable. So how many people here are familiar with Moore's Law? We've got a decent number of people. For those who don't know, the prediction was Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel in the 60s, said that every 18 months, computing power would roughly double, so measured by number of transistors on chip. And if we look at actual computing power here, from 1971 to 2011, you see this same sort of effect. We sort of coast along, and then all of a sudden, computing power goes through the roof. If you, however, map it logarithmically, which is what this black line does, and you say, let me measure the progress as a function of previous progress, you see that doubling every 18 months happen. It becomes an inexorable sort of line towards progress here. So I'll leave you with this fact, that while the data set is much smaller, the exact same thing is happening in programmatic media. So when we founded MediaMath in 2007, there were roughly 15 billion opportunities for programmatic impressions to put on a consumer a day. Today we stand at over 80 billion. And again, if we look at it mapped in real terms, it sort of looks like it's flat and up. If we map it in logarithmic terms, it's scarily similar to Moore's Law. And we've moved from 5% market penetration globally in 2009 to today in countries like the UK and France and the Netherlands to 50 to 65%. So, what did we talk about here today? Hopefully somewhat coherently. One, there's a massive opportunity and a disruption at the same time. Your consumer is always in front of you, is always in front of the brand, and there's an opportunity to either get that right or wrong. You're either going to say the right thing or the wrong thing with correspondingly positive or negative results. Two is there's massive environmental change being driven by consumer behavior and the technologies like programmatic buying platforms that have come in. And again, that represents massive opportunity and massive potential downfall for brands. And I just say finally, at the end of the day, if we keep it simple again, really what we're talking about here is use properly the technologies that programmatic represents, give brands and agencies the ability to, at the end of the day, present much more relevant marketing to consumers across channels. That's all I've got.